government and a small budget surplus of 440 million Zimbabwe dollars in the first quarter. That was despite the fact that spending is rising much faster, 820%, than revenue, about 630%. If you adjust for inflation, revenue was up 10%, spending up almost 40%. And that's incredible, really, because if you look at the wage bill alone, there was a 1/3 decline in the employment bill, again adjusted for inflation. In other words, it's hardly surprising the civil servants should have got a pay increase the other day and should have got that extra US dollar so-called handout. So that's the state of the economy as it is today. So from there, I want to move on and look at the future and see, is there an exit strategy? How do we get out of the kind of mess that we're in? I started by saying it was a state of stagflation. Escalating inflation, a collapsing exchange rate, falling employment, declining real wages, declining consumer spending, and an economy shrinking by a quarter in just 2 years. Nube's strategy is in tatters, if it ever was a strategy. His plan was to control money supply and government spending in the belief this would reduce inflation, stabilize the exchange rate. And what little chance that had of success was blown out of the water by COVID and the lockdowns, especially the lockdowns abroad, which cut off an awful lot of business for Zimbabwe. Looking ahead, the promises of political as well as economic reforms have not been honored. ZANU-PF is already amending the 2013 constitution even before it's fully implemented. And in recent months, many economic reforms, so-called, have been abandoned or reversed. Hardly a week goes by without the Reserve Bank using some kind of measures, usually statutory instruments, to tighten up on one aspect of business or another. So over the last year, we've had a mix of currency, exchange controls, curbing the use of mobile money, banning the publication of parallel market rates, all aimed at trying to stabilize the exchange rate. The authorities believe somehow that this is a public relations exercise, that people really do want to hold Zimbabwe dollars. And if you can just take away the idea that there's an alternative, then they will gratefully accept the bond note system. Now, this is clearly not working for two reasons. One is that demand for foreign currency vastly exceeds the supply. And the second is that for all of us, the US dollar is the currency of choice. Where I live, if you just drive down the road where there are guys selling fruit and vegetables and flowers at the side of the road, all of them, without exception, are quoting their prices in US dollars. We did a webinar session last week, mainly with accountants, I'm ashamed to say, not being a great admirer of accountants. But on this occasion, we did a bit of a poll. And the first poll, we said, which currency would you like to charge and be paid in? 91% of the nearly 200 respondents said the US dollar. And the second question we asked was, is Zimbabwe re-dollarizing or de-dollarizing? 94% said we are re-dollarizing, we're going back to the dollar. Nobody wants to hold the bondies, the local currency. In April, after COVID struck, the government appealed to the IMF for help and was rejected. More recently, it wrote to the major donors in what is called the Paris Club, and they also declined to help. government's failure to implement its shadow IMF program that it negotiated just over a year ago, plus its record on human rights, has quite honestly alienated the donor community. So there is no plan B and there's no bailout. Zimbabwe is on its own and likely to remain that way unless or until there's some kind of political change which unclogs the wheels of international re-engagement. So what are the critical issues? I'm suggesting two scenarios, a base case and a worst case. I don't have a best case, partly because the base case is the very best we can hope for, but also because, and I'll come back to this, ironically, the worst case could turn out to be the best. This is because the worst case of accelerating economic, possibly also socio-political collapse would bring about radical change in two elements. One, re-dollarization, which is essential. And two, political change that would facilitate, make possible re-engagement with the international community. So they're the scenarios. I give, first of all, the figures for 2019, then the base case, which, as I say, is the best case, and the worst case. GDP, as you see, declines 12, 15% this year. Inflation averages at best 675, at worst as much as 900. At the year end, inflation best 700%, worst 1,000%. And in fact, that could be much worse because we're already almost at 800. Wages, at best 200% increase, at worst perhaps 250. Employment, minus 15% if we're lucky. Minus 20% is a more realistic number, I think, if the economy is going to be shrinking as much as it is. To turn to individual items, first of all, output. GDP decline this year is the largest since national accounting in this country began. All sectors, with the possible exception of agriculture, will decline. We know that, according to the latest estimates, maize production was something like 17% higher than last year, thanks to the slightly better season after last year's dire drought. The largest falls in outcome, I think, output, come in some service sectors, especially tourism, hospitality, travel, manufacturing, mining. Exports fall in line with the 12% decline in global trade. And all sectors hit by lockdown impact on value chains, especially imports, particularly manufacturing and retail, but also exports. We've already heard of how gold and platinum and so on have been adversely affected by the shutdown or disruption of refinery operations in South Africa. Gold is doing well and may help to sustain mining, but base metals, platinum, diamonds, etc., diamonds is a very bad scene, are likely to decline. Taking the domestic economy, disruption from lockdowns, exacerbated in some cases unnecessarily by government intervention in commercial transactions on mobile platforms and so on. Basically, they've made it harder to do business and more expensive to do business. Major disruption, obviously, in the informal sector, especially the combis, but many other aspects. And the footfall, retail footfall, as we call it in the central district around the country, has obviously been reduced by lockdown regulations. Turning to employment, sharp falls in both formal and informal. Impossible to quantify impact, especially in the informal economy. Productivity, I think, is suffering from travel disruptions. I think there's an awful lot of nonsense being talked about how convenient and what a good idea it is to work from home. Well, there's no substitute for face-to-face relationships and dealing and so on. There's no doubt that productivity and efficiency will be less efficient where people have to work from home. Services, retail, manufacturing are particularly vulnerable. Turning to labor, which is a key area, industrial unrest is a major possibility. Demands for payments in US dollars we're hearing almost every day, particularly from the public sector, but I'm sure private sector, I'm sure a lot of the people on this platform are getting their employees coming to them and saying, I want to be paid in US. And who can blame them? There's a lot of support for wage increases from the official poverty line figures, which I'll talk about in a second. And nationally, there is a risk of overlap between industrial unrest and social political unrest. There is the graph showing the pattern of poverty datum line as compiled by government for a family of 5. I've taken it back to 2016. You can see that the average wage was marginally higher than the poverty datum line right through the period 2016 to 2018. Then, as inflation took off, then the situation began to deteriorate. And you now have a situation where perhaps your best, by the end of this year, you might be looking at average wage, I don't know, if you're lucky, 2,500, 3,000. And already we have a poverty datum line for family of 5 for the month of May of 8,500. And this is not sustainable. I think everybody on this platform knows this, that there's obviously a wage explosion coming. Businesses will respond by raising prices, by seeking efficiency gains, cutting costs. That means obviously laying off employees. They will try to diversify into new products, into new markets. But that's not going to be easy under the existing situation when everybody in the region is faced with the same sort of problems. We only have to look at the dire situation that's developing in South Africa. Now, with such high inflation, and for many, heavy reliance on imported imports, few firms are going to avoid a squeeze on their margins. Their profitability is already taking a knock, and it's going to take an even bigger knock as we go forward. The necessity to increase prices, to trim services, to trim product ranges, inevitably means greater consumer resistance. All firms will face market shrinkage due to lower real wages, due to lower employment. And firms will have to prioritize trying to protect their market shares. The steep increase in production costs at a time of rapidly declining demand will put profit margins under intense pressure, forcing many businesses to go under. And firms unable to match labor demands for higher wages will trim their workforces. Because households and firms will restructure their budgets to fund essentials, rent, food, transport, electricity, education, those businesses dependent on discretionary spending will face very severe challenge.